Yeah, I mean, spam, if you think about it broadly enough, is the pollution of the attention age. You could think about spam in narrow terms, but anytime someone's pulling your attention for their own benefit and not to yours, they're spamming you. And we're all being spammed all the time. One of the other sort of signature aspects of attention age discourse is the fact that a false story is often more attentionally salient and compelling than a complicated truth.
Well, hello and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'm Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Hayes, author of The Siren's Call: How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource. For over 20 years, Chris has written and reported on a wide variety of political and social issues concerning everything from economic democracy to the intersection of politics and technology. He's the Emmy Award-winning host of All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC. All right. And also hosts the podcast, Why Is This Happening? Which is a question I think we've been asking ourselves repeatedly in recent weeks and will be in those to come. So please welcome Chris Hayes. So Chris, welcome back to the club. It's great to have you here, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Let me start with asking you a big question connected to the book, and I think we have lots of questions coming in from the audience as well, but I think this will get us into some of the particular who's and how's and why's connected to the book. As you put forth in the title, how did attention become the world's most endangered resource?
Well, I think there's a few things I think to understand about why we are where we are. I think the first is to understand a transformation into what we call the digital economy and what we commonly refer to as the information age, something that happened, geographically largely driven by people in this very area, maybe some of the people in this room. And I think we tend to think in terms of information, data, as being the central feature of that, right? This transition from material production, the manipulation of atoms, to non-material production, the manipulation of ones and zeros and bits. A steel worker, right, versus a healthcare claims adjuster or software engineer. And I think we intuitively understand this, right? That we're sort of in this post-industrial, post-manufacturing economy. I think the thing we don't understand about that is the relative importance of information and attention. And this is an insight that goes back to a lecture given by the very brilliant political scientist and economist named Herb Simon in 1972, in which he just makes the point that information actually consumes attention. And that attention, therefore, is sort of the scarce resource. Information is replicable, it's essentially infinite. If 10 different firms or 100 different firms or 1,000 different firms have your data, it doesn't make that big a difference in your life. But if someone has your attention, then they have it and you don't. One way to think about this is a metaphor that I stole from the great law professor Lawrence Lessig, who used to teach at Stanford and is now at Harvard. He's talking about the difference between physical property and intellectual property. He says, if you put a picnic table in your backyard and your neighbor steals your idea of having a picnic table in their backyard, it doesn't really change your life that much. But if they steal your picnic table, well, then that's a very different thing. You don't have the picnic table and they do. So attention is like the picnic table, right? It's finite and it's bounded and it's consumed by information, which means, almost as a logical matter, as there is more and more information, which I think we would all agree there is more and more competition for the fixed and finite resource of our attention. The second aspect of this is the fact that attention is a complicated faculty that has some different dimensions, and one that I think is worth stressing, and then I'll let you ask another question without monologuing the entire time. And that is simply that we have a faculty for what we would call compelled attention. And this is really one of the key insights of the book and really an important one to get, which is if someone busted through the door back there screaming, everyone would whip their head around before you had any opportunity volitionally to decide not to, right? The faculty of attention has an involuntary component, the wail of a siren going down the street, a baby crying on a flight, a waiter dropping a glass in a restaurant, right? Gunshots on the street, right? All of that compels our attention. Because we have that faculty, we also have the faculty of voluntary attention, which is what all of you are doing so well right now, thank you. Which is volitionally choosing to put your attention on something. There's a battle between those two, and one of the core insights of the book is, as attention becomes a competitive resource, right, and more competitive because of how much information there is, those competitive attention markets will tend towards attempts to engineer compelled attention. How do you figure out how to compel attention? Here's an example. The engineering that goes into what we call the haptic feedback in the phone. Right? When it buzzes in your pocket, you notice it before you get to decide whether you want to or not. And that is what I contend in the book, the sort of experience of the attention age, which is all of us, as Odysseus was, bound to the mast, attempting to not listen to the sirens.
And then there's social attention that you talk about. I mean, certainly connected through the phone in lots of other ways.
Yeah, so this is the other distinct aspect, and I think a really important one to understand the age we're in, which is beginning in the 1950s, a sort of set of laboratory experiments with people finds that if you give someone the following task, you put headphones on them, and they get one sequence of word in the right ear and one sequence in the left ear, and you said, just attend to the right ear and write it down, right? Because our power of attention is so powerful, you can just totally block out that left ear. You won't hear any of it. And no stimulus in that ear will penetrate because you're so focused. There's one form of stimulus that will penetrate, and that's your name. And this is called the cocktail party effect. I think everyone has probably had this experience at some point in their lives. You're at a party, you're at a conversation, you hear your name somewhere in the room. It's like, whoop. Right, thank you, yes. And so what happens in that moment is actually sort of a remarkable feat of brain power, right? Because think about what's happening. You're blocking out all the other conversations to listen to the conversation, and yet there's like this little kind of like NSA sitting in your brain that's actually scanning all the information for this keyword of your name and then wrenches you back. And the fact that word, someone paying attention to you, is as profound as it is another aspect of the attention age that's distinct. The television and the radio and the newspaper and other forms of getting your attention could not mark you as you, but social media can. Mentions, right? Why are mentions engineered into every platform? They're engineering the cocktail party effect into the program, right? So this is another way of compelling attention.
One of the things that's really interesting to me in the book is how you get into in-depth discussion of becoming alienated from yourself, the way that attention is being manipulated. Can you talk some about that? Because I think that's a huge shift. It's not just like, oh, they have all this data on us,
right,
and they're trying to make us look at things. There's something fundamental about our identity that's being.
Yeah, you know, one of the reasons William James, when he writes his first sort of book on psychology, he writes a lot about attention, and the reason that James spends so much time on attention is because James's key philosophical preoccupation is free will. To what extent we have it. And he locates the ability to focus the beam of thought where we want it to as constitutive of free will. I think the experience of the attention age is often the feeling of our attention being taken in spite of what we want. A thing that should be ours properly being outside of us, which is the kind of, I think, ubiquitous sensation of alienation that we all sort of increasingly exist in. That when your attention is being taken against your will, or on the edges of your will, or at some part of a kind of version of yourself you don't quite like, that produces a sensation of alienation. Something that should be proper and internal to you is now externally extracted from you. And one of the comparisons I make in the book is what Marx writes about labor in the 19th century. Marx's theory of value, labor theory of value and alienation, is that prior to the specific set of institutions, legal regimes, market structures that created industrial wage capitalism, humans had always worked or toiled in one way or the other, right? But it gets transformed into this wage commodity that gets taken from them and produces this sense of alienation. If you think about, for instance, the shoemaker in a pre-industrial setting, he makes the shoe, he goes through the entire process of making the shoe. At the end of it, he owns the shoe, he sells it, someone else has the shoe, he has the money. Compare that to someone in a sweatshop 12 hours a day stamping soles, right? That labor now feels outside of them in some fundamental way. And you don't have to be a Marxist, and I'm not one, to see that there is a core insight here, right, of a transformation of the ordering of society and the internal experience of your relationship to your own labor that comes with the creation of wage labor at scale. Just is an enormous transformation. And something like that is happening with our attention now. And it produces, I think, the most pernicious effect, which is this kind of ubiquitous sense of alienation.
So one of the other aspects of attention, you know something about it, hosting a news program for 4 nights a week as well. Needing to navigate that, needing to maintain it. What's different from trying to draw attention for a news program versus how it manifests itself through social media, et cetera?
There's a few different things. I mean, one of the things that, there are some things that are similar and some things that are different. So one of the things I have to do as a function of my job is grab and hold people's attention. And if I'm not good at it, I don't keep doing the job. It's that simple. I know this because there was periods where I wasn't so good at it and they were like, you're not gonna keep the job. Not theoretical. And you know, like so many things, attention is weird because it's necessary but never sufficient, right? So like, if all I did was try to hold people's attention in my show, that wouldn't complete any project that I'm interested in. I don't want to hold people's attention just for the sake of it. I want to hold their attention for the project of providing them with information necessary to the project of self-governance. So one of the things that I think has happened is the way the attention age works, and particularly algorithmic attention markets, which is what all these platforms are, right? They've created these little algorithmic attention markets, is that those things don't have anything they're trying to do with the attention other than to maximize it. So there's no project there other than to keep your eyeballs. And there's also no human being trying to come up with some craft to do it. It's all fully automated. And one of the really important insights here is, in the same way we have this sort of difference between compelled attention, someone dropping a glass in the restaurant, and voluntary attention, right? Voluntary and involuntary. It's much easier to grab attention than to hold it. So like anyone in a room, if you said to someone, look, I'm gonna send you in that room, there's 500 people in that room, and I just need you to get everyone's attention. You could do whatever it takes. Like, basically everyone can do that. If I said, there's 500 people in that room, I'm gonna send you in there, hold their attention for an hour. Okay, well that's a lot harder, right? So we all intuit that. And what has happened is, because of that, the endpoint of this sort of algorithmic drive is to just grab iteratively. I call it in the book the slot machine model. Right? The slot machine can keep someone sitting there for 8 hours, but it doesn't tell an 8-hour story. It's just little 7 5-second increments to grab again. And this sort of slot machine model, which I think is also a model that like Donald Trump employs, has become a kind of dominant model. And it's not the model I'm trying to do in my show, although to be totally honest, a fair amount of cable news does use these sort of tricks as well, right? Like, we got like 1 million graphics coming at you, and right, there is a little bit of a casino thing happening on that screen to try to kind of keep people's attention.
So since you brought up Donald Trump, how does he figure into the attention economy?
I think he's probably the most significant figure of the attention age because he has, through sheer feral instinct born of deep psychological brokenness. I mean, I'm not a shrink, but that's the way it looks to me. Maybe look, I want to just be clear. I might be wrong, and maybe he's an incredibly happy and fulfilled guy. That's a possibility. I don't know. I'm not in his heart. From the way it appears to me is that this is a person who is pathologically dependent on others' attention, and because of that pathology has intuited that that's the most important resource that exists, and is willing to do a thing that a lot of other politicians aren't willing to do and most people aren't, which is to prioritize the getting of attention over positive attention. Most people, and most politicians certainly, if given a choice between someone not paying attention to you or loathing you, but paying attention to you, are like, I'll chill, I'll lay low. Because attention is so profoundly important to him at almost cellular level, has intuited that the sort of sheer quantity of attention, the dominance of the attentional atmosphere is what matters. And that has been kind of his one simple trick to reduce things. And it was a weird thing of someone who having a particular, I think, sort of psychological predisposition meeting a moment in the institutional life of the country that he is optimized for, that many people are not optimized for. Elon Musk appears to be optimized for this as well. So that's where we are. And I think it's not an accident that we're in this situation. In fact, it sort of makes a kind of perfect sense.
So we were talking backstage right before the program about some of the latest things that have grabbed attention, connected, say, with USAID. Can you talk about that and your take on what is happening and potential consequences?
Well, it's not good. Well, I think there's two things happening. One is that Musk is interesting because I think that he has, through exactly the process I write about it in the book, which is the kind of insidious corrupting power of excessive social attention that comes from social media, I think he's like completely cooked his brain. So fully pickled from just sitting in this brine that is the like constant feedback of social attention from strangers. I mean, you could see it, you can track it, you can see it. And I think it's driven him to act out in the way he's acting out. What he's doing right now, I think, which is this kind of, I don't know the right way to describe it. I think if you talk about it as a coup, you sound kind of like a crank, and yet it's about the most accurate way to describe it. There's like a posse of unelected 20-somethings, one of whom, by the way, was so young that Wired magazine wouldn't name him. Did you see this? There was like reporting, and it was like, I was like, is he a child? Is he a literal minor? With this crew that is, I think, flatly illegally attempting to tear down the constitutional order and wrest control of the government of the most powerful nation on earth. I've certainly never seen anything like it. One thing I think it's worth noting here is that Donald Trump did a lot of things in the first term that revealed how much governing behavior is regulated by norms rather than laws. Like what just isn't done or is done, and pushing on those norms. And that was a sort of important lesson. But I think it's really important not to conflate that with what's happening now. What Musk is doing, by I think any fair reading of the law, is a crime spree. It's flatly illegal. He does not have the lawful authority to, as he boasted, feed USAID to the wood chipper. USAID is an independent agency properly constituted by statute of the United States Congress, signed into law by the president, given appropriations yearly by the same Congress and president. Elon Musk doesn't get to decide. If you want to get rid of USAID, you can go to Congress, the Republicans control both houses, and pass a law getting rid of USAID. That is absolutely within their constitutional prerogative. They can do that. They can get rid of the CFPB that way. They could do a lot of things that way. They could reform the civil service law that we've had in various versions since the late 19th century under President Rutherford B. Hayes, who's my namesake, and not really, but one of the, and sort of the first person to institute civil service reform. All of these things are possible to do in a constitutionally appropriate manner, which is to pass laws and sign them, and you've got control of both houses of Congress and the White House. What is clearly not lawful, and I think actually might be genuinely criminal, not just lawless, but I think like downloading the data of Americans onto private servers in the hands of people who are not government employees, I think is likely genuinely criminal. Is on a completely, it's in a totally different space than the norm busting of the first term, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that.
Well, we also have had tariff news the last couple of days.
Yeah. I think everyone, for most of their life, has just been chomping at the bit for a huge war with Canada. I think it's probably, I think we can all admit it now, that it's been brewing in all of us for a long time.
Well, I certainly understand.
Finally, someone has the guts to come out.
It makes me understand the War of 1812 in a more visceral way.
It's truly one of the most insane things I've ever seen. I mean, what's weird about this, a few things to say about this. One is that there's a political logic to this sort of animus towards Mexico, a certain kind of demagogic logic. But like, I fail to see the political logic of making Canada enemy number one. He just said today as an explicit thing that he wants them to be 51st state. Like the ask, we're gonna tariff the heck out of you until you become the 51st state, is a declaration of, sort of, or hostility at a level that's not an ask they can accede to. It makes no political sense. It makes no substantive sense. It feels like Mad King territory. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, I think a lot about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And something I keep coming back to about that single act was how one man with one action managed to make everyone in the world worse off. Like, it was bad for Russians who've died by the tens of thousands and whose economy's taken a hit. It was bad for Ukrainians who have died by the tens of thousands and whose economy has taken a hit. It was bad for all of Europe, who saw their energy prices skyrocket, who are spending now more on defense. It was bad for the US. It was the global energy price spike that it caused hurt everyone all over the world. No one came out better. It was just a total net loss for everyone. That one decision. Obviously, the stakes and level of human misery are nowhere in the same category with a tariff war with Canada. It's just totally different. But it does share that same dynamic, that it is possible to unilaterally take a decision that just simply makes everyone worse off, which is what's happening right now.
Well, and certainly there are plenty who have made the analogy between, so we haven't talked about Greenland, but sort of noise that we've heard about the US wanting to possess Greenland being analogous to Putin wanting to possess Ukraine, Taiwan being in China's sights.
Yes, I don't think it's a particularly novel insight to say that traditionally, historically, right-wing authoritarian populist demagogues have needed some form of military expansion as part of their project. And that's what we're seeing here. It's a flatly expansionist project. We're going to take Panama, Greenland, and Canada. I don't think this is something the American people want. I may be naive and proven wrong. Maybe people have just been sitting and stewing about Greenland for years, and I've just failed to perceive this. I do think, and many people have conjectured, that like the fact that the Mercator projection makes it look really large is a huge part of what's driving this. But yeah, again, like I'm joking about it because what else are you going to do? But it's obviously wildly dangerous. One of the things I think that characterizes our times is simply the receding memory of the global battle against fascism. Mm-hmm. I just think that, the generation that fought fascism is largely dying off or near the end of their lives. The experience of that battle and the havoc that it wreaked on the world. And I think that's, you see this in all sorts of places, the rise of far-right parties in Europe, the AfD, for instance, but that's a kind of central issue, I think, for all of us.
Well, and I think to that point, I mean, I joked about understanding the War of 1812, but certainly for years now, I've felt like, okay, I understand the 1930s in a way I did not before, in a visceral way. Coming back to something that you said, so what else are you going to do? I mean, one of the things with this book, so there's attention and how it can be kind of controlled by the slot machine, but the need to focus on what matters. So how do you do that?
It's really a challenge. It's very difficult. I mean, focus is really a power. Focus is power in a distracted age. And one of the challenges for us in attempting to deal in this attentional environment is to focus. But it's also not that easy to do. There are genuinely more newsworthy things to cover than can be covered. I think that's all intentional, obviously in the same kind of, attention war that Trump and Musk are waging, right? Which is to create this sort of sense of, that same sense that people feel with relationship to their devices is now the way they feel to the national discourse. Like they can't, they're sort of in this strange relationship to it. Journalistically, we've really been trying to work through this, and obviously we're doing this on the fly. We're trying to react in real time. We are trying to make sure that we focus and not let things go. The three kind of principles that I've sort of enunciated that we've been thinking through is one, focus is power, so stay on stuff. Two, and this is actually being challenged right now, is modulation and tone, that you can't just turn the dial to 10 and leave it at 10 because it starts to sound like 5. And then you don't have any room to go to 10. But that's being challenged right now because it sort of feels like maybe what's happening deserves a 10. But then also, if I put it up there now, then I don't have any headroom later. So this is a non-trivial question, the one I wrestle with. I don't know the right answer to it. The third thing I've been really focused on is work from the facts towards the story, not the other way around. And what I mean by that is Trump's approach to managing the news is to create constant sort of blips of story, but you have to actually figure out what's happening factually and not just work backwards from the story. And this has been really important just in sorting through what are the EOs actually doing? What is the legal regime for USAID? What actually happened? Here's a great example. We don't know why the plane crashed. Still, I mean, the NTSB is going to get to the bottom of it. There's some preliminary indications of contributing factors. In a country that's had 150 million flights since the last deadly crash of this kind, which is how safe American air travel is, by definition, something that is this catastrophic has multiple causes. That's almost logically true, right? So we don't know the facts yet. And one of the really important things is not to just work from whatever story he provides, which was, well, both, I think, obviously false and also despicable. Yeah. I mean, one of the things, I mean, that was just such a disgusting display. One of the things when he was reading, he's reading this bizarre Fox News article about a pilot program that had been launched in 2019 when Donald Trump was president to recruit people to work for the FAA. Part of the reason that this recruitment effort has been going on is because there's been a sort of long shortage of air traffic controllers. So part of it is just we're trying to get new people into this field because we need more of them. And he's reading this long list of people with various disabilities that were being recruited as this kind of punchline, including dwarfism was one of them. It's why couldn't a person with dwarfism be an air traffic controller? Think about that for 2 seconds. Why? What's the joke here? What's the problem? Obviously, a person with dwarfism could be an air traffic controller. In fact, that would be great. And yet that was the sort of big punchline of his performance.
So one of the other things that you write about in the book is something that's very hard to focus on because it's so big, right? You talk about climate change. So how do we tackle that amidst the attention economy?
Climate has been something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, both first order about climate and what we have to do to avoid catastrophe, and also how to cover it. And part of the problem is that it is so attentionally diffuse. Like, carbon in the atmosphere is literally imperceptible. We can't see it. We can't smell it. We do not know it's there. I mean, even compared to something like smog, right? Like air pollution, which you can, like, gets your attention, particularly if you're in a city with smog and if you ever travel to places that have high levels of air pollution. And indeed, the attentional salience of air pollution is a huge part of what produces the conditions of political action around it, and why you see, mobilizations in different polities around the world against it, because you notice it. The confounding thing about the biggest challenge we face civilizationally is that it's invisible and tasteless and we can't smell it. Now, obviously, manifestations of it are very attentionally salient, the wildfires in California being the most recent, but they're sort of constantly and everywhere. But it has proven a really difficult challenge in a world in the attention age to keep attention on it. My favorite example of this is that a movie I truly love, Adam McKay's Don't Look Up, which I thought a great film. So he's got this, he's like, how am I gonna make a movie about this? And he just creates another disaster that's way more attentionally salient, right? Like, the problem with climate is precisely that we never get to look up and see the asteroid. That doesn't happen. And finding out ways to deal with that, I mean, one of the things we do is when something obviously sort of spectacular, and I don't mean that in a positive sense, I mean like in the full sense of spectacle, like what happened in California. When something like that happens, we cover it from a climate lens, right? Because that is a time when attention is focused on it. It's like, this is what we have wrought and will continue to. But the sort of background fact of the steady and invisible accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, it presents a real challenge.
Well, that's to your point, right? With the fires in Southern California, certainly anyone who's looked at studies over the years, one of the insights is that the more catastrophic events will get more catastrophic, yep. Right? The winds will get worse, the fires will get worse, et cetera, et cetera.
And that's why it's really important, I think, to cover these catastrophes as climate events, which is the first and obvious step, which is what we do on the show, but not all the media does.
So one of the consequences of the fires, though, has been some dams have been opened up in California.
Have you guys been following this? Yes. I think you're probably following. I've been telling people this on the East Coast who are following it less, and I think obviously this is a more tangible thing for folks that live in California, obviously, because water in California is a huge deal, and you guys know about, the ins and outs of Californian hydrology, which our president is an expert in, I guess, which is a very funny idea. I really think, again, this kind of Mad King idea, where, and throughout history, you'll read about authoritarian figures or monarchs or dictators who get obsessed with something, and then they go crazy on it, and it ends up being catastrophic. Trump has this idea fixe about the water, all the water that's there that isn't getting to LA. And what we found out was that he basically, someone from the White House, we don't know the details of the sort of chain of custody of this, but someone from the White House browbeat the Army Corps of Engineers to undam 2 rivers in the Central Valley that are dammed for a reason, because it's not the growing season. Billions of water was let into these 2 rivers. It's basically being wasted. They don't flow to Los as far as I can tell, and unless I keep being like, am I missing something? Like, I don't want to say something dumb. Like, I must be missing something. There must be some intersection. And the answer is no, as far as I can tell. They have literally nothing to do with the level of water in Los Angeles, which, by the way, wasn't the problem. It was a water pressure problem. So they released all this water until I think folks in the Central Valley like pushed back enough to be like, you're gonna flood our fields. And then they ratcheted back, but then he just was posting, he's posting these pictures about, look at the beautiful water flowing. They should have listened to me years ago. And it's like these like drone shots of the channels full of water. I don't know what to say. I mean, it is funny, but it's, again, this was like one of these things that was like pretty close to being a real disaster until someone managed to ratchet it back enough that it wasn't a real disaster, but who knows how many of those we get.
So that's, I think, kind of a good setup for a question from one of our audience members here, and I think one that you wrestle with. How do we avoid giving Trump the attention that he craves while still staying informed and in a way that we can take action?
Yeah, it's the sort of nightmare paradox that the troll presents to everyone, right? Like, this is trolling politics, and the way that trolling politics work, and I write about this in the book, is that in the same way interruption or grabbing people's attention is easier than holding it, getting negative attention is easier than positive attention. Like, if all you care about is attention, and your shortcut is to get it, like, you could go, scream at people on the BART, and you would reliably get attention. It's harder to persuade people or get everyone on a BART car to like really think you're groovy. Like that takes more work. And so this sort of troll shortcut, which has become dominant in politics, also presents this kind of this conundrum, which is that if you're paying attention to the troll, you're giving them the attention they want. I mean, I got to say, the problem is Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And so one of the things I do think that's a question is, are you giving attention to him or are you giving attention to what he's doing? Which are often distinct things. Like, one example is, last week he had Dr. Phil ride around with ICE. And clearly, like, he really wanted all eyes on ICE. He's obviously very upset that their like numbers aren't higher and all this stuff. And at the same time he had Dr. Phil riding around with ICE, he also fired all the inspectors general Friday night, and they didn't even put a statement out on it. So that to me is an example where he wants attention on the Dr. Phil ICE raids and not on the IGs. But then you can also get wrapped around the axle if you're trying to kind of compute your independent assessment of where to focus based on what he does or doesn't want, because he may make the wrong judgments about that. And this is actually a really important thing. The trade-off that Trump has figured out is not like it's costless. Let's be really clear on this, right? This idea that all attention is good attention has resulted in him being underwater in favorability and approval for most of his political time. He was actually not a particularly successful president the first time around. He was a one-term president, which is fairly rare. It's actually hard to beat incumbents, and he lost because he was unpopular. He was not able to pass the signature achievement that they wanted to pass, which was the revocation and repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Like, people have gotten a little psyched out by the fact he won, which he won. And there's a bunch of reasons we could talk about that. But politics didn't go away. Public backlash didn't go away. Public pressure didn't go away. He won by less of a margin in the popular vote than Hillary Clinton beat him in 2016. This is not a colossus. Orban and Modi have 65, 70% approval rating. That is not what we're dealing with here. This looks a lot more like Brazil and Bolsonaro than it looks like Orban. And keep in mind, in South Korea, where they're right-wing wannabe authoritarian, when he tried to disband basically the constitutional democracy, his approval rating was like 25%. And the people didn't stand for it, right? So it's not, I don't want to overemphasize that this sort of courting of negative attention is some like magical foolproof plan that always works. There are tangible negative costs to it that really matter in terms of politics, and people can't give up on politics. That's all we got.
So there are a number of people here in the audience who are kind of asking variations on the question, how do we use the attention economy to pull the fire alarm on the lawlessness, right? Or to bring it to a stop?
So I thought today was I think people are getting off the mat. Today was interesting. I don't know if people saw what happened at USAID. Right? Wow, you guys are pretty plugged. I mean, you are. It is like noon on a weekday, and you're here listening to me talk, so I shouldn't be that surprised. Like, yeah, we're on it, obviously. Who do you think you're talking to? So yes, I thought today was actually really important, right? What is being done to USAID it's lawless, it's wildly destructive. There are people who will die because of it. My favorite, I don't know if people saw the detail. Again, you guys know everything, so I'm probably just repeating things. You're like, yeah, we read the entire internet too every day, buddy. The people who are being paid to guard ISIS prisoners in a prison in Syria who had just had their salaries cut because it was a USAID contract. Probably not great to stop paying them, right? What do you think? Good idea? No. So there's enormous substantive cost to this. But again, all this stuff is remote. USAID, I think the vast majority of Americans couldn't tell you. One of the things we see consistently in polling is that the median voter or average American citizen thinks the US spends like 100 times on foreign aid what it actually does. So I think they think this is sort of a politically advantageous fight. But Democrats in Congress showed up at USAID today. And they held a press conference, and protesters showed up. And then they tried to get into the building, and they were turned away, and then I had to come on stage. I don't know what happened, how that resolved. But that's a moment of being like, okay, we're going to go force attention on this and have a conflict over it, which is a necessary conflict in the boundaries of, nonviolent, liberal, democratic civil society. And you got to do that. Like that. So I feel like, okay, well today, we saw this with the OMB memo, right? That was something where members of Congress, people in the press, people in civil society started directing attention, focused attention on something that genuinely was not popular. They had to kind of back down, although they didn't really back down. And I think both of these are examples of like the kind of thing that we need more of. That there really is going to have to be, I know everyone's exhausted, people feel demoralized, people feel paralyzed, all this stuff, but again, civil society, organized small d democratic action is what we have. It's all we got. And
so one of the members of the audience wants to know if the courts will be able to catch up to Trump's executive orders.
This is a great question and a real question mark. I think the courts have been a little slow here, although we did get, I think we may get an actual, we got the court filing, let me get my civil procedure here. The court filing on Friday got an administrative stay on that OMB memo, but there's a possibility of an actual temporary restraining order happening. And in fact, they were back in Ali Khan, who's the district judge, court today, in which the plaintiffs were saying that they hadn't actually rescinded this freeze. And we have some examples in that filing, including from a nonprofit in West Virginia that hasn't gotten its payment from HHS, it's going to have to furlough its employees, and they do dialysis. So I think we might see some more aggressive action by federal courts at the district level. I think their posture, Musk and Trump, is we'll just do everything until someone stops us. And I think they also think they can count to 5 on the Supreme Court for a lot of this stuff. I think they want to set up an Impoundment Control Act constitutional test before the Supreme Court. They think they can get 5 votes there. I think they want to set up a constitutional test about the constitutionality of independent agencies, which was sort of considered in the CFPB case, and basically the people who wanted to get rid of all independent agencies lost. In no small part, I think, because it's very hard to slice the salami thin enough that you get rid of the CFPB but don't also take out the Federal Reserve. which I think like even John Roberts is like probably not a great idea to do that. So I don't think there's a lot of bravado right now, but I think a lot of this stuff is really flatly illegal. Whether the Supreme Court ultimately joins that decision or not genuinely is an open question. But I do think we're going to see more and more district court TROs and things like that.
So you mentioned the Fed. One of the points you make in the book and talking about your own profession as a journalist is there's a dual mandate that comes with your role.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve famously has this dual mandate, which is to keep inflation low and growth high, right? You want the economy growing, but you want inflation low. And what makes central banking difficult is that often those two are in direct tension with each other. You're trying to navigate a dual mandate in which the two things you want to maintain are kind of on a sliding scale with each other. And I think of that about how journalists relate to attention, right? Which is, it's my job to both keep people's attention and give them the information they need. And those are in tension sometimes, like the Fed. I mean, there's a great passage in The Phantom Public by Walter Lippmann in the late teens, early 20s. He's covering the Treaty of Versailles and the resolution of World War I. And he says, the American public has a great interest in what happens in Versailles, but they're not interested in it. In the same way that a son has a great interest in his father's business that he'll inherit, but isn't interested in that. And so what he's identifying, is that this tension has been there forever, right? That things that are the most attentionally salient, the lurid and the prurient and the shocking and the tabloid, aren't necessarily the most important, and attention is not a moral faculty. The challenge for journalism is that you have to harness attention. You must. It doesn't work unless you do, but you also have to have this other thing you're trying to do. And in the same way that there's no, you can't run a central bank off an algorithm. It requires human judgment to balance those two. It requires human judgment to try to do good work in what we're tasked with doing.
So one of the other questions which you certainly tackle in your book in depth, so in the attention age, how do we adapt to filtering information and controlling disinformation? And I would add to that kind of dealing with spam as the challenge of our age.
Yeah, I mean, spam, if you think about it broadly enough, is the pollution of the attention age, right? And you can think about spam in narrow terms, but anytime someone's pulling your attention for their own benefit and not to yours, they're spamming you. And we're all being spammed all the time, right? One of the other sort of signature aspects of attention age discourse is the fact that, and this relates to something I was just saying about attention not being a moral faculty, is that a false story is often more attentionally salient and compelling than a complicated truth, right? So, if it really were the case that the ghost of Hugo Chavez and some Italian satellite and the Chinese got together to steal the 2020 election, that really would be a big story if it were true. This is true about a lot of, it's pretty attentionally compelling to think that aliens came down and built the pyramids. I don't think they did. But often if you're engaging in an attentional marketplace, right, that is just selecting for attention, has no other animating principles or values, conspiracy theories and false attentionally salient stories outcompete more mundane true ones at scale. And this is a real problem.
So a number of folks have asked kind of variations on this question. The biggest challenges facing journalists today, Democrats and Republicans, right?
What is the biggest?
What is the biggest challenge? Yeah, you guys, here's what you need to work on.
The biggest challenge facing Republicans right now is not to blow themselves up. I really mean that. They are courting catastrophe. And by the way, we're all on the same ship. We should have learned this in 2020 during COVID, but we all wiped it from our memory. in a kind of weird post-trauma response. But I have watched this, I keep thinking about this amazing headline in The Onion in 2004. And it was, Iraqis stunned by competence of Bush campaign. And I keep thinking about this because it perfectly captures something, which is being able to win an election does not mean that you've got it all figured out and you're going to do a great job. Michelle Goldberg made this point on my show the other day and said, they're doing the coalition provisional authority to us in the US now. Remember the coalition provisional authority that took over the Iraqi government? And there are these stories about some 23-year-old heritage intern who's going to run the central bank and how they fired everyone in the civil service. Remember? Right? Debathification? And what a disaster all of it was. So the Republicans have a real substantive challenge, which is not to destroy the country and not to destroy the machinery of government that people are going to notice in ways that are going to make them really angry. And again, I'm not rooting for them to politically succeed, but I don't want them to destroy the country. Democrats actually have a pretty simple job, which is to oppose. You're the opposition party. I get it that you got real challenges. I think there's a very clean and simple story to tell about a bunch of the wealthiest, most powerful people screwing over ordinary people. That is the theme here, that weaves together both concerns about democracy and concerns about kitchen table economics. And I think it's a fairly straightforward story. Like, they're looting the country for their own benefit. I mean, one of the things that I tried to hammer home in the election unsuccessfully, and was almost so unbelievable that people couldn't get their heads around it, was that it was 100% the case that high prices were the #1 most salient issue in polling. A. B. One of the two candidates was promising to raise everyone's prices. And C, that candidate won people most concerned with high prices. All three things of those are true. He got a question from a woman at a Fox town hall about how he was going to lower grocery prices, and he said tariffs. It has been the case that he's promising to raise people's prices the whole time. And now we're here. And I think there's a pretty straightforward story to tell about that. In terms of the press, I think it goes back to the three things I was talking about before, but the most important thing is to not act like you're afraid of these people and don't cede ground. Like, we're a central part of the constitutional order, and I'm not going to give that up.
Regarding the point about literally not blowing things up, I will note, right, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists did move the doomsday clock it's 86 seconds now, right, where it's actually the closest it's ever been to midnight, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's not good.
So
I hope we don't have some, 19-year-old Neuralink intern running that. But who knows?
So one of the members of the audience wants to know, as you were working on this book, was there anything that surprised you as you were writing it?
One thing, well, a few things. One is it's great to go back, to be forced to read, to get yourself out of the presentism that I think journalism tends to inculcate and read about in the 17th century Blaise Pascal saying, I've come to the conclusion that all the troubles of man arise from his inability to sit by himself alone in his own chamber. Wrote that in 1644. Or to go back and read the Stoics, and they're like, why are you so concerned what people say about you? Why is that? What does that do to you? Why are you, why is that getting in your head? They didn't have social media, but. So some things are reassuringly part of the human condition. And I find that greatly comforting. The Buddha sitting under the banyan tree in 600 BCE, trying to deal with why we have these kind of whirring minds of desire that we have to kind of wrestle. it wasn't surprising, but it was it was wonderful to be reacquainted with the fact that some of the stuff at the core of what the current age exacerbates are things that we have been wrestling with for the whole time we've been here.
So some of the folks here in the audience want to know, because you are on social media, anything positive you would say about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the weird thing about this, and I read about this extensively in the book, is like I love the internet and have since I was 13 or 14. And I do think it's actually really important to remember that there are different versions of the internet. You know, there was a commercial version of the internet that was the first big mass version of the internet, which was AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy. AOL sort of won that battle, and everyone thought like that was going to be what the internet was, and then it wasn't because it got defeated by an open internet. A set of non-commercial open protocols. Like we still have two that function. Email is an open protocol, right? Anyone can email anyone else with an email address. You're not inside someone's platform. I mean, you might have a Gmail account, but you could have other accounts, right? And they can all talk to each other. Really simple syndication, RSS, which was developed 20 years ago, is the architecture for podcasts. It's the reason that when someone says to you about a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, that it's not controlled in one platform because it's an open protocol and open architecture, right? Wikipedia, which is created during that age and we still have, there are ways to have open versions of the internet. These are technologically feasible and possible. We've actually had them before. Not only have we had them before, we've had open versions of the internet defeat closed versions of the internet before. Mark Andreessen developing Mosaic and creating essentially the open web is what beat AOL. So the internet doesn't have to be 4 or 5 tech platforms that monetize attention as what the internet is. The other thing I'll say is there's lots of things I love about social media. My favorite thing about social media is the delight of aggregated human brilliance and creativity. People are smart and they're funny and they're talented. And smart, talented, funny people come from all walks of life and all backgrounds and all places on the globe. And people that, don't have fancy jobs writing comedy write incredibly funny things. And because of the glory of the internet and sometimes the way social media operates, that can get its way to you. And it is an incredible thing about the way that at scale, the best version of this technology is to kind of connect and aggregate human talent and brilliance, right? In spite of all of the hierarchies that exist in the world, where someone who may have a job that has nothing to do with dancing is like an amazing dancer, right? Or people write unbelievably brilliant little parody musicals that make their way to you. And all of this sort of amazing human creativity that is maybe not encouraged or cultivated or promoted in the other structures of life that can be aggregated and delivered over the internet, I think is a beautiful thing. That's the thing that I want to encourage.
So I did learn backstage before we came out, before you studied philosophy, you embarked on studying computer science as well. So come by some of this, not only through play, but through...
Yeah, I mean, I was a pretty intense computer nerd in high school. I programmed Tetris in Pascal when I was 16. And I was going to be a computer science major when I got to college and then washed out of that. Or didn't even wash out, I just decided I didn't want to do it.
One of the other concepts that you talk about in the book related to the internet and platforms in general is using a term that Cory Doctorow came up with. Platform decay is one of the ways it's described. Yes. There's a single term as well.
Gentrification.
Right.
Yeah. Which I think, again, is I feel like we all have that feeling, right? That these platforms are getting worse, and they're getting worse in a way that seems specifically related to how they're trying to monetize themselves. That there's some connection between those two. I think you see this very clearly with Google. I think one of the weird things that's happening with AI right now, which, by the way, is, there's obviously an entire book and set of conversations to have about AI itself. But one of the weird things about the way AI is being deployed now on platforms is this weird, pushing AI on you all the time. Like Clippy and Microsoft Word. It's like, yeah, I'll use you if I need it. Just calm down. Like, why are you right here in my face? Like, just, I get it. I'll use you if I need to use it. But there's this there's obviously a set of market incentives right now about AI deployment and this sort of AI race, but it's leading to some very weird stuff on the consumer-facing side of AI. Like, do you want me to write your email? It's like, no, I want to write my email. Thank you. Okay? I've been doing this for a minute. I'm good. I got it.
Well, and so thinking about email, I mean, and you talk about Ezra Klein and what is it, the boring AI scenario?
Yes. There's a great line. I forget who he was interviewing. If you think about AI in terms of attention, right? The amazing thing about AI from an attention standpoint is that it is a great information processing system to conserve attention in the same way Google was. So if you go to Claude, or you go to ChatGPT, or you go to DeepSeek, which I've been playing around with, which is pretty incredible, I gotta say. And you say, give me a one-paragraph summary of Herbert Simon's 1972 lecture, Designing Organizations for an Information-Rich World. It does a really good job of giving you a paragraph that distills it down and thereby conserves your attention, right? So, there are a bunch of ways that we can think about AI being useful. One of them is a better version of search, essentially. Right? The distillation of information so as to conserve your attention. The problem is on the other side, it's also really good at generating a lot of stuff. Like generating bots to populate your social media feed, or generating emails, or generating complaints in litigation or in regulatory questions or FCC comments, right? And you can think about this boring AI apocalypse. This is not my concept. It's this person who's talking to Ezra about, like, you have AI both generating a lot of stuff and then screening all of it, which is like the steroids era in baseball when like the pitchers and the batters were both juiced out of their minds. And it's like, you guys could just both stop using and then have the same interaction naturally, that we have like this like weird AI arms race where like AI is generating a lot of stuff and then we're using AI to screen and summarize it, and what exactly have we gained?
So kind of coming back to a very, very human level, there's a member of our audience here who knows she's the mother of an adult trans kid, and wondering if you can talk about transgender protections and the role of the attention economy and doing this for better or for worse.
Yeah. First of all, I would just say we need to stand up for trans folks, full stop. And there's a phrase that came out of the anti-Bolsonaro protests that someone told me about, which translated means, no one lets go of anyone's hand. No one lets go of anyone's hand, right? Like, folks who are undocumented, folks who are trans, like, we're not throwing anyone off the ship. We're not sacrificing anyone in the volcano so that they won't be mad at us. That's not how you build power, and that's not what we're gonna do. Right? So that's the first thing. There's a really interesting question about trans folks and trans life and attention. They have devoted an insane amount of attention to a group of people that is, in numerical terms, really small. And at one level, you don't want to be like, well, there's not that many of them, don't worry. Because like you do want to stand up for people's human dignity. But also like when Dick Durbin and that, had Charlie Baker is now the head of the NCAA and asked like, how many trans athletes are there in the NCAA? And I think he said like a dozen out of 100,000 athletes. I do think it's actually really worth reasserting the scale that we're talking about, which is just like, even if you can't convince people that, for instance, as I believe, gender is essentially socially constructed and people choose either through what they receive through the world or what their own volition is. Some people aren't going to agree with that, and like, okay. But I do think there's like an argument about pluralistic decency that is a majority argument that we need to make. Just like let people be who they are. And just And I do think we, and I mean this in a sort of broad sense of, I think, progressive folks or whatever the right way to talk about it is, I think patriotic pluralism is the majority position in America. And I think this mean-spirited cruelty and this picking on people and getting up to talk about how folks with disabilities shouldn't be air traffic controllers and trans kids shouldn't get health care and trans soldiers should be kicked out of the army and people shouldn't celebrate Black History Month and the CIA's women affinity group that used to meet once a month to celebrate like female spies should be disbanded. I don't think that's a majority position. I really do think we're better than that. And I think we have to talk about how we're at, I mean, again, this is like just old school creedal stuff. I'm not trying to do anything cutting edge, but like, we are a nation of people from different places and different experiences. That pluralism is woven into the fabric of the country when they were battling over a different set of forms of difference in the Constitution around religion particularly, and also born with the original sin of horrible racial oppression. And those are both our inheritances, but we choose one side of that inheritance to cultivate and grow and appeal to our sense of Americans that we have something special and different. And part of that specialness and differences is tolerance and pluralism and looking out for each other and letting people do their thing. And I think that's a majority. I think that's a majority position.
So as we're getting close to wrapping up, a number of folks want to know what's one really good or the best piece of professional advice you've ever received?
Professional advice. Slow down. I talk too fast. So I've slowed down a little bit over my time. And honestly, the biggest, most important thing is it's basically a version of be yourself. And I think particularly vis-a-vis the specific thing I do on television, you have to be who you are. And the whole thing only works if you're being honest and authentic to who you are. And so there's a lot of ways you can get in your head about that. You can read people saying how annoying they find you online. Those people definitely exist. You could look at the numbers for your show and whether it's rating in the way you want, and all of that stuff is going to lead you fundamentally to second-guess stuff about who you are and how you communicate. And at a fundamental level, you have to trust yourself.
Well, our thanks to Chris Hayes. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Chris Hayes, author of The Siren's Call, How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Chris's new book here or at your local bookstore. And if you would like to become a member or support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Stephen Saum. Thank you and take care.
Thank you. That was great.